businesses are starting to reopen as COVID-19 restrictions are lifted across the globe. In today's program, you will receive guidance on the best practices for safely returning to the office.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks, Sherm, for having us here today. As Tony mentioned, I'll be moderating today's webinar, so please engage, ask questions, and I'll be sure to get them over to our presenters. I'd first like to introduce you to our first presenter, Nancy Inesta. Nancy, could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Hi, I'm happy to be here today. My name's Nancy Inesta. I am a partner at the law firm of Baker Hostetler. I am a labor and employment attorney who, since February, have been really focused on the issue of COVID-19. Todd and I actually were in San Francisco where we did our first presentation on issues related to employers and what they needed to do in preparation for what was then not yet a pandemic, but some of the issues with respect to the virus spreading. I also serve on my law firm's task force, coronavirus task force, so I've been involved even at the firm level on addressing a lot of the issues that we're going to talk about today and how to address all of the complications related to returning employees to work. So we're very happy to be here today.
Thanks, Nancy. We're happy to have you and your expertise. Todd, another partner with Baker Hostetler, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. I'm, as Nancy mentioned, also a labor and employment attorney with Baker Hostetler. Up until COVID, the probably 90% of my practice was on what we would call the traditional labor side, union negotiations and so forth. But as COVID has kind of run through the nation here, I've been working more on the COVID side and then also with implementing technologies and so forth to be able to do things remotely, since a fair bit of our practice involves face-to-face communication, or at least it did. So as Nancy said, happy to be here today and appreciate the invite.
Thanks so much, Todd. And then lastly, Peter Steinfeld from AlertMedia. Peter, can you talk to us a little bit about your expertise?
Sure. So I help run the sales team at AlertMedia. And for those of you unfamiliar with us, just very quickly, we help thousands of companies around the world communicate more effectively during emergencies like the current pandemic through our easy-to-use two-way multi-channel mass notification system. And the perspective that I'll bring to the table today is one of disaster recovery and business continuity. My experience over the years has shown that really nothing ever goes according to plan during an emergency, and the current situation is certainly a testament to that. So a major key to successful reopening in your organization really lies in your ability to react to and deal with all of this uncertainty.
Thanks so much for all of you joining us today. Today, we'll kick things off by discussing best practices your organization should follow when thinking about returning. And then we'll transition to discussing strategies and considerations and how those might differ based on your specific business needs. Then Nancy and Todd will offer a bit of legal expertise to the audience so you can ensure you're thinking about compliance and addressing local and national laws. And then lastly, we'll discuss what's next and how you can plan for the future. Before we do jump into the live content, we wanted to just kick off with a poll and take a minute to better understand where your organization is as far as reopening. So have you fully reopened, maybe partially reopened, haven't even started to reopen, or maybe you never closed because you were deemed an essential business? And we'll go ahead and share those results with the audience so everyone can kind of take a look and understand where everyone's at. Nancy and Todd, is this resonating with you as far as what you're seeing with your clients a little bit across the board here?
From my perspective, definitely, Alex. We do, especially on the traditional labor side, we do a lot of automotive work. They were deemed critical infrastructure. And so those plants obviously stayed open, which presented its own set of issues. But then we also represent, hospitality companies, and I wouldn't even name all the industries because I'll leave something out. And yeah, we are seeing it's by industry largely a very wide spectrum of how far along employers are in reopening.
Great. Well, it sounds like we have a great mix on the webinar today, and hopefully we can share some expertise. So Peter, can you kick things off for us and talk a little bit about best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Alex. So I would say one of the first best practices you can implement is to create a pandemic task force. It really should be dedicated to assessing both needs and capabilities, as well as incorporating current guidelines that you're hearing from the government and other third parties that you follow. Think of this COVID-19 task force, for lack of a better term, as your organization's really hub for big picture pandemic-related planning. The team should absolutely meet regularly to digest the most current pandemic info, ensure everyone's on the same page, and then translate everything into a course of action that makes sense for the business. I'd say that the team's job can really be broken down into 3 key activities. The first is really just constant situational assessment, because things are changing so rapidly, sometimes daily. Next, the team should really decide on any kind of practical steps the organization should take in response to this new and changing information that keeps coming in. And then finally, the team should consistently monitor the actions that have been taken, both for effectiveness and for continued appropriateness based on how things seem to be unfolding. Now, because the task force's actions will impact the entire organization, it's really crucial that the team has representatives from all key stakeholder groups. Large organizations may employ a more complex structure where each representative in the core team heads a sub-team on a particular aspect of your company's response. And then for smaller organizations, I would say a single 6-person team should suffice. Generally speaking, your organization's core team should roughly follow the structure that you see on the screen here on this slide. And then just remember, overall, your goal for this pandemic task force is to determine your business's ability to reopen, which impacts when you can bring people back, at what level, and then in what order. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next area, which is evaluating the needs of the business.
So in evaluating your business needs, I think a really good starting place is to really assess what segments of your business really are critical in terms of coming back into the office. And one of the first questions I get all the time is, do we have to treat everybody the same way? And the reality is you do not. There may be office workers that you have.
I think we might have just lost Nancy.
Yeah, looks like we did.
You know what, I can pick up for if that works.
Yeah, thanks, Todd.
Oh, sure, no problem. And just generally, I think, you know, as Nancy was starting to say, I would not suggest viewing reopening as an all or nothing proposition, that either everybody comes back or nobody comes back. I think it's, you know, a better sort of approach to it is to decide who do we need to have back and who can we have telework, which, you know, obviously presents its own set of challenges. But generally, you know, if you have people working from home, you know, then you have the issue of, do they have appropriate workspaces? Do they have appropriate tools? Do they have Wi-Fi, computers, so on and so forth? And then, you know, a sort of tack-on consideration to that is, what are the state rules in terms of reimbursing people for that? And then in addition, what are our policies? What do our policies state? Because of course we want to be consistent with our policies. Some states, for example, California, if it's something that's necessary to get the job done, we have to reimburse them. So, you know, printing is I think the easiest example to see where the line is. If I have to print something out to mail it or file it, or you know, for whatever reason I need a physical document, then I have to be reimbursed for my printer ink. On the other hand, if I print stuff out just because I would rather read it on paper than a computer screen, so more of a convenience issue, in that respect, I'm probably not entitled to reimbursement of my printing supplies. So, you know, as you're kind of dividing between the people that we need back and the people that we don't, one consideration to be mindful of is, in regard to the people who are teleworking, do they have the appropriate tools, and are there any reimbursement responsibilities that we need to honor in that regard? Now, and we sort of alluded to this in the questions. I think in terms of whether we need to go back to work and whether we want to go back to work, you know, the challenge here is, as Peter alluded to, is we're really in unprecedented times. So, whereas in other cases, there might be kind of a template to follow or some historical experience to draw on. We're all kind of in a vacuum here. And so, kind of where do we start to make this decision? That's kind of the question that we're often getting from clients, is just not even understanding, what analytical framework should we use? My suggestion has been, look at your status during the quarantine or the stay-at-home orders. And by that, I mean kind of from March through roughly the middle of May. How is your business operating? What measures do you use to determine success? Is it efficiency? Is it effectivity, productivity? There are all kinds of measures. But I would suggest looking at the business status during that period, what was working and what was not. And in regard to what was not, how much, incrementally, how do we change that to get to where we can live with it? So, again, just not to keep drawing on the same examples, but in regard to our clients who were deemed critical infrastructure, particularly those in Michigan, because Michigan did not just allow critical infrastructure employers to operate completely. They still had to go through their operation and identify which portions directly pertain to the critical infrastructure designation. And so what we suggested in that context is, okay, you need some of your workforce, if you're in physical production, manufacturing, things of that sort, or any kind of service industry, hospitality primarily, but restaurants, the list is endless, where you have to have at least some people at the workplace physically. What can we do to make them safe, which we'll get into here in a minute. And then, what kind of risks are we willing to accept, and what kind of risks are we just not willing to accept? And then we also want to look at it from the employee's perspective. How were they feeling during the quarantine period? Were they mostly happy working at home, or were they complaining and wanting to get into the office? Oddly enough, some people do want to do that. And so, what we've been suggesting is look at what the business was able to tolerate, what the workforce was able to tolerate, and then see what bridges you can build between those two. And understanding that's general, but given, the breadth of industries and so forth, it's somewhat difficult to get more specific. Our next slide is preparing for the reopening. I think Nancy is logging back in.
I think she's back, Todd.
I'm on. Hi, everyone.
Okay.
Great. Can you hear me? I apologize for that. I think one of the things, and Todd didn't go over this, on preparing people to return to the workplace, one of the questions I get a lot is, are people able to be as productive and really perform their work? Because as the ability to bring people back is an option, there's still some nervousness about returning, but things like being able to stay on Wi-Fi, what people's surroundings are, whether or not they're having to deal with, interruptions in the workplace. While it's really cute that it's happening during this whole pandemic, and we're able to laugh at it when children come and interrupt, or when dogs run through the picture, or cats or animals. At some point, what I'm getting more and more from clients are, we really need people to sit down and buckle down and get back to business. So it's definitely something that needs to be considered. Do people have sufficient, access to Wi-Fi? Do the programs work sufficiently well that you're able to keep up the type of interface you need in terms of returning people to work and making them productive? And finally, are you able to have the same measurements to test whether or not people really are being productive? And you're going to have to maybe find new ways to be able to measure people's productivity, whether or not they're being successful at their job, because you don't have the same ability to monitor them. So these are things that you definitely want to consider as you're making these decisions. So the next thing is really preparing for reopening with respect to really getting people back into the workplace. And the one thing that you're going to have to start considering is pulling and reviewing all of the different orders that pertain to your industry. And you have to be really very careful, because I spend probably I don't know, 60% of my time now really reviewing the, parameters of what work orders are going, or what return to work orders from the various state, local, LA, for example, here in California, if somebody's opening in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles, I'll have to review both the state orders, both the LA, the LA County orders and the LA City orders. And you need to make sure that you're complying with each and every one of those, because there are different levels of measures that are being implemented. In all of those, there's different things that are being recommended or mandated, and these are the things you want to look for. First of all, you want to make sure that you're reading everything that applies generally to in all of these various orders. The second thing is you want to make sure that you've captured all of the possible orders that are industry specific. So for example, I work with some entertainment clients and they are going back into production. There's at least 3 or 4 industry orders that, might apply to them. There's an order on, office workspaces and what you have to do to prepare office workspaces. There may be an order that is based on what the construction industry is needing to do. And because they're basically building a set or taking down a set, some of those construction protocols are going to apply to their industry. They might have some type of food service. So some of the portions of the restaurant orders may also apply. So you really want to be very careful that you're not just pulling your one main industry specific order and thinking that that's the only one that you have to follow. Just to note, some of the interesting things in the orders is you really need to read them carefully. Some of the protocols in the orders really are just recommendations, and you need to look through and distinguish where it says you must, or or other times where it says you may, you should, or we recommend. What I recommend in terms of implementing those orders is that even where it says you should or you may, you really want to get all the low-hanging fruit. You want to do as much as you can, especially for the easy things that may not be required, but really create a better, safer environment. And also, the more you're able to do, the more kind of buffer you're going to have with respect to anybody claiming that you should be liable with respect to anybody either getting the virus or you exposing your employees to the virus. And Todd is going to talk about the operational factors and preparing facilities for this.
Sure, and kind of just to build on what Nancy mentioned there at the end, Nancy and I have both already seen employees filing what are called intentional torts, and that is basically a claim that the employer did something that was so inherently dangerous that the normal workers' comp structure shouldn't apply, and that the employer should be liable for things like punitive damages, consequential damages, and things of that sort. Those cases are already getting filed, along with nuisance claims by employee families saying that a failure to follow CDC guidelines it constitutes a public nuisance and things like that. So a lot of the issues that we're going to talk through today are really to give you some ideas on even now building a defense to make sure that you have an answer for those kinds of claims. In terms of operational factors, this really does build off of the first point that we discussed. Who do we need to have present at the facility to operate? And that's really the starting point, because that tells you how many people, literally how many bodies you're going to have in the facility at one time. And building off of that, quote unquote number of bodies, then we have to decide, do we need to reconfigure space? Mindful of the fact that social distancing is a minimum of 6 feet, the more the better, essentially. With the number of employees that we have and the tasks that they have to perform, can we maintain social distancing? Because some tasks, even if you have 2 people in a 70,000 square foot facility, if 2 people have to be side by side to perform a task, the square footage of the facility suddenly becomes less important. But generally, we need to decide how many people we need and what operations are they going to be required to perform. And then based off of that, we decide, all right, how do we repurpose space? Do we do things like make aisleways one direction so that people aren't, coming face to face? Are there, if there's a pass off of work orders or, a handoff of machinery, things of that sort, any kind of calibration issues. We want to look at, okay, how do we do this either through technology or through some alternative form of communication where we get the necessary information across the line without, unduly subjecting our employees to either exposure or possible transmission. Another operational issue that comes up quite a bit is visitors. Are we going to allow visitors? And if you are going to allow visitors at the facility, sort of part and parcel with that is understanding what precautions their employer takes. Because again, anybody that comes into our facility is going to be exposed to all of our employees. And all of the protocols in the world don't matter if we're going to allow visitors in who don't observe social distancing and who haven't taken the appropriate caution in terms of how to reopen. So, my suggestion generally would be err on the side to the extent, it's feasible within the parameters of your business. I would suggest erring on the side of at least encouraging all visitors to communicate over the internet or by phone rather than a personal visit. But if the nature of your business is such that they have to be able to tour the facility, some of you may have contractual commitments that require customers to have access to the facility. If that's the case, then I would really suggest, and I think Nancy would concur, that you reach out and find out what are they doing. What protocols are they going to have in place before they ever come to your facility? What protocols are they willing to follow while they're in your facility? And then are they going to commit to let you know if somebody from their company tests positive? Because if whoever visited your facility was exposed to that person within the incubation period, you may have an issue. And then, kind of building off of the operational factors, the next thing to do is prepare the facilities. And I mentioned that a little bit earlier with the one direction aisles. Another thing that we've seen clients doing is repurposing conference space or meeting space. If you're not allowing visitors in the facility, that space may be at a premium, because if you're trying to social distance, every square foot helps. And so it may be that you want to repurpose conference rooms, set up some processes in there or whatever is obviously practical. Ordering supplies is another one. There's typically that's or it can be an in-person activity. Anything that we can do to streamline the supply ordering process. Obviously, there are procurement rules that have to be followed and policies that have to be adhered to and so forth. But again, looking at the procurement process, where is there person-to-person interaction, and how can we mitigate it? Water fountains, break areas, hot food facilities, things like that. Water fountains, unfortunately, are a potential congregation area. I would suggest having bottled water available, but then that's also comes with the obligation to decide how are we going to distribute it? How are we going to make sure that people get water bottles without being exposed? So these are, again, just ideas that we want to think about. Signage and capacity limits for small rooms. If it's really a small room, if it's not essential and can't be repurposed, you may want to put some sort of signage that it's closed until further notice. And then finally, if you do have workspaces or cubicles or any kind of stationary workspace, including a workstation at a machine, if we have to have two people less than 6 feet from each other, you may want to consider, number one, face shields, or number two, or in conjunction with face shields, some sort of plexiglass barrier or something, as most of us have probably seen at drive-through windows and things like that, putting up some sort of transparent barrier.
And this leads to employee needs, and this is really preparing for what the employees more on a personal level are going to need. Making sure that you have the supplies to give people with respect to whatever protective equipment you're going to give them. So this means if you're going to give out cloth masks, and in a lot of orders and in a lot of states, you're required to do that at the expense of the employer, those are things that are going to need to be ordered. You're also going to want to start looking at your own policies. What do your leave policies look at? What is going to be your position on accommodating? There could be the potential that if you don't have to provide leave, for example, under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, you're not obligated to provide leave for things such as individuals who don't have childcare, who are at home with their children, who can no longer get dropped off at summer camp, or don't have access to the regular care person or care provider just because of the coronavirus, and they're not allowed to have those people in their homes. You're really going to want to know in advance, what is the position the company is going to take, what leave are you going to provide, what benefits are available to employees, either based on the benefits that the company itself provides, based on benefits that you have to provide pursuant to the law, such as federal law and the FFCRA, what local ordinances may or may not have been passed. I know in Los Angeles there were sick leave ordinances that were passed in LA City that the county has followed suit on, and other cities in California have followed suit on. And you really want to have kind of a ticket list of everything an employee might be eligible for, and then what are you going to do when they run out of that eligibility.
That kind of brings us, and let me advance the slide here. That brings us to, I'm sorry, I think I'm on the wrong slide here. We're on slide 9, correct? Employee. Oh, office.
There you go.
There we go. So in terms of the severity of COVID-19, this is obviously a factor that we're suggesting folks should be aware of. And generally, the larger issue here is kind of the idea that perception is reality. And so while, some of the media coverage gets a little bit exhausting, you need to be aware of what's being reported, particularly in your area, because that's what COVID is to your employees. It's what they're seeing on TV, what they're hearing, and so forth. And that's really the situation that you're dealing with, right or wrong. The situation that you're dealing with is the way that your employees perceive it. Another thing to be aware of is changes in weather, and I kind of smiled when I saw this all the way back. It was, I think, February 24th when Nancy and I spoke in San Francisco, and all the way back in February, Nancy was telling people when the weather gets warmer, people are going to go outside, and this thing is going to transmit. And sure enough, I think we're all seeing that right now. The warmer weather means that we're going to have more get-togethers, more family functions, and so forth. Yes, there are stay-at-home, or there are orders from the government saying don't do that, but people are going to do it. So we have to be, it makes the employee temperature checks, the health screenings, all that, all the more important, because we know that people are not properly socially distancing outside of the workplace. And so that does kind of make it incumbent that we go a little bit further as the weather gets nicer. I think that gets us to the next slide. PPE. With PPE, there's a couple of things that we want to be particularly aware of. On the hygiene stations, hopefully everybody has hygiene stations throughout their facilities. Make sure the hand sanitizer is full. Make sure that people aren't congregating in front of the hygiene stations. Tissues and hand washing, all of that is critical. Increased cleaning is also another issue that more of our clients are addressing. Here's the thing, as we use more, I would say, abrasive cleaning chemicals, you may have some OSHA requirements as a result. You're absolutely going to have to keep the MSDS forms for any cleaning agents that are used in the facility. Those need to be available on request to employees. But if you're having a contractor come in and clean, all the more, you've got to know what chemicals they're using, what are people potentially exposed to. Also, in regard to contractors, what protocols are they following? Their employees are going to be in our facility as well. So everything that they're contacting is going to be brought in with them, or at least that's the assumption that we have to have. So, I would suggest, if you are using a contractor, in addition to knowing what chemicals they're using and whether or not there are any exposure issues associated with them, I would suggest finding out what protocols are they implementing to make sure that their employees are safe, and then also getting a commitment from them, sort of like we talked about in regard to visitors. If one of their employees tests positive who has been in the facility cleaning, Are they going to commit to notify? Because we may have some quarantining obligations as a result. The required uniforms. The one thing that I would really suggest in regard to required uniforms is please be very careful what you call quote unquote PPE. That has a legal significance and it does come with some obligations. So for example, a cloth mask is not PPE as the default unless the employer treats it as PPE or categorizes it as PPE. That's shorthand. A true OSHA lawyer would probably, have a heart attack at that summary. But generally, you want to be very, very careful what you call PPE because it does come with some obligations. Now, a formal medical mask like the N94, I can't remember the designation. Those medical masks, those are PPE. Face shields are sometimes aren't. So if you're using face shields, you want to be aware of what the OSHA implications are in that regard. Because while there is no, and I did want to mention this, I don't know that it's specific to a slide. There is no OSHA overarching rule on COVID-19. The AFL-CIO sued OSHA trying to mandate the issuance of a COVID-19 rule. The DC Circuit said no. So as of today, OSHA has not issued an overarching rule on these are the measures that an employer must take to reopen. It's probably one of the reasons why we're having this. But all of the OSHA rules of general applicability, MSDS forms, PPE, all of those sorts of things are in play with COVID just as they are anything else. So be very aware of that. The fact that we all have to clean, we all have to use measures that we haven't used before doesn't mean that we forget about OSHA. And then finally, employee training. This is one of those things at the end that we can implement all the protocols in the world. If the employees don't know how to follow them, they're of questionable value. So just make sure that employees understand what's expected of them. And that should hopefully give them a comfort level that this is for their safety and to make sure that they aren't exposed to something just because they come to work.
So we'll move on quickly to employee health monitoring. I would say that I spend maybe 60% of my time answering questions in this area, and this is really what can employers do with respect to ensuring that they're bringing employees in a way that's safe. And there's a couple of things. The first thing is, what health screenings can you perform? The EEOC has confirmed that employers, when they're returning employees to work or hiring employees, they are able to ask for a COVID test that clears the employee to come to work. So basically something showing that the employee has tested negative within a reasonably recent time frame before they let that employee back into the workforce. Now, this is not to be confused with regular testing. There's nothing the EEOC has said that with all of your current employees, once you return them to work, that you can continuously test them for COVID-19. So be really careful before you start implementing some kind of like random testing procedure, because that is not something the EEOC has condoned. Nor has the EEOC said that you can test for the antibodies. So that is not something that you can require your employees to submit to. You do not have a right to know if they've ever had it. And another thing is with respect to COVID in general. One of the kind of rules of thumb I've been sharing with my clients is only ask about symptoms related to COVID-19 and make sure that all your documents in referencing an employee's obligation to report certain information, medical information to them, has to be limited to that information that is related to COVID-19. You do not have the right to ask for medical information that is not related to the threat of COVID-19 coming into the workforce. So you don't have increased right about asking them about their symptoms overall, how they're feeling overall, or even whether or not there is something that makes them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, so that you can make decisions about, or so that you can work with the employee to make decisions about returning to work. The next thing that I get questions about all day long is about temperature screenings. and whether or not employers can take employee temperatures. Now, while you can do that, you're allowed to do that, it really all revolves around how you decide to do it. What I do not recommend is you should not pick your least favorite employee and put them out in the front to take everybody's temperature. That is not the way to do it. You really want to have a very strict process, and what I recommend to everybody is, to the extent that you can hire a third party to perform this function, that is going to be your best bet. Not only does it take some of the burden off of the employer with respect to compliance, with respect to the amount of information that they have access to, it also, you will have somebody who's a third party who's coming with appropriate PPE. And this is, for those of you who are not in the medical profession, what type of PPE is required for these situations is highly regulated. If you are going to do it yourself, the CDC on their website has basically a checklist that states what PPE is required depending on how you are going to perform the temperature check. So whether you're going to be within 6 feet, whether you're going to be behind a partition, whether you're going to be face-to-face, whether or not you're going to touch the person or be in contact with the person. Depending on those things, the CDC has laid out what personal protective equipment is going to be required, and it's going to be everything from a gown to potentially a face mask to a face covering. So you need to be very careful in terms of complying with that. One of the things that I have encouraged everybody to implement is a process by which employees have to report to you whether or not they have symptoms. You really have to have something in place in writing, hopefully that the employee has acknowledged, that goes through what obligations they have to tell you what COVID-19 symptoms they've had, whether or not they have COVID or have been presumed positive with COVID, or if anybody in their household either has symptoms, is presumed positive, or has COVID. And you want to make sure that you have a process that's stated, that the employee has acknowledged, that as they enter and come back into the workplace, that they know what their obligations are. So in the interest of time, we'll move on to social distancing.
We had talked, about a lot of these topics, and given that we do want to allow time for questions, I don't want to, get too repetitive. The one thing that I would say in regard to this slide is in regard to shift scheduling. Obviously, if you have a union, for example, shift schedules are a mandatory subject to bargaining, so there's some bargaining obligation. If you don't have a union and you reschedule shifts in a way that people don't like, you may get one. So that's another issue that you want to be aware of. But generally, just as an example, we have a client with a 3-shift operation, and it has a 30-minute tie-in between each shift, for handoff and so forth. They've gone to a 3-on, 3-off schedule with 4 crews, each of which works a 12-hour shift. So if I'm A crew or B crew, I work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 12 hours, either 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And then I'm off for 3 days. And when I'm off for those 3 days, the C and the D crews work. And that's been a way that they've come up with to make sure that people aren't exposed to an inordinate number of coworkers, and to try to have a minimum number of shift tie-ins. So that's really the gist of that slide, I would say. Go to operational resilience. Or did I advance?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's just to round out the last item in this section. We get back to something that's near and dear to my heart, and that is operational resilience. I would implore you not to overlook business continuity as it relates to your reopening plans. You have to prepare mitigation strategies for the risks associated with reopening. So how are you going to keep the doors open if an outbreak occurs at one or more of your locations? Just think of that meatpacking plant you probably heard of in the news over in Germany, where hundreds of people were infected all at once. What can you do? Well, you're going to want to set up redundancies and try to spread risk among the different roles and departments. For example, you might want to consider cross-training employees, especially for critical roles, update personnel succession plans, especially for executives and other key roles out there, distribute similar roles among different shifts, and then recommend, or I'd say perhaps even mandate, remote work for certain roles, get people away from the situation. And then finally, ensure that you have access to a reliable emergency notification system for urgent communications, such as a possible COVID-19 exposure. It's really critical to listen, adapt, and then communicate quickly to avoid confusion and improve outcomes. Calling audibles and communicating them is just absolutely vital in any emergency, but that's really hard to accomplish if you don't have a solid mass notification system in place. So measures like these will go a long way in keeping you operational, even if one or more employees test positive for COVID-19. So Nancy and Todd, can you take us into the next portion of the presentation around business-dependent strategies?
So moving on to this, really, in terms of the different strategies, I think that one of the things, and I'm going to actually, in moving forward, I'm going to go into the high-risk considerations for employees, Peter, because I think this is another area where I'm getting the most questions, is what happened to the employees who either cannot go back into the workforce because they are in a vulnerable category, and then with the two other categories of people who, for other reasons, cannot. So what we really need to understand is that on top of all of the legislation with respect to coronavirus, on top of the benefit packages and everything else that employees might be eligible for, you cannot forget that there's already laws in place that monitor things like people with disability, that protect people with disabilities. And those disabilities do play a role, and there is an intersection between those disabilities and what happens in this space with what you're doing with respect to your business strategies in returning people to work, and how you're able to do that safely for those individuals who may be otherwise covered. So in addition to considering the safety of the workplace, you are going to have to address the special needs of certain people with respect to disabilities in the context of the laws that already exist. And what I keep seeing our clients who are calling, they basically have all of the coronavirus protocols covered. They basically know what benefits people are eligible for with respect to sick leave, with respect to local ordinances, but they're forgetting things such as engaging in the interactive process with people who may have, for example, a disability that makes them more or less vulnerable to COVID-19, or employees who are caring for somebody in the home who is more or less vulnerable. And what I have been advising, what I think it's a really important thing to remember, is that you have to be aware and you have to engage in those conversations. So as you return people or try to return people to work, you need to understand who could potentially be in those risk categories, and you have to engage in the interactive process with them. You potentially have to provide leave under the ADA. You may have to provide FMLA leave coverage, whether it's the COVID coverage or whether it's the standard coverage that you provide to any employee who has a disability. And you have to make sure that you're following all your standard procedures and your policies in that space. One of the questions I get a lot is, are there certain risk groups? For example, can I tell a pregnant person not to return to the workplace? Can I tell somebody that's of a particular age, an older worker, that they shouldn't or can't return to the workplace? And you cannot do that. Again, what you have to do as the employer is offer what is available to them with respect to what benefits and what leave policies are applicable, but you cannot force people to take them, and you cannot make those decisions for them. So you would give them the same opportunities you have given to everybody to return to the workplace. And then as those people come forward and say that they have concerns, you're really going to want to engage with them in the interactive process to see if there's any other type of leave or scheme that they're able to continue to take leave. And in doing that, that is really a time before people start coming in to evaluate your workplace policies. And also, if you've done all of your homework with respect to returning people to the workplace, you're also going to have your ducks in a row with respect to understanding that even where some people do not fit into any of these benefits, there still may be things that you're willing to do, for example, granting unpaid leave, granting people time off work, where they're otherwise not covered, but still, for whatever reasons, cannot return to the workplace for reasons that might be compelling, such as child care or family circumstances that are beyond their control due to the pandemic. And with that, I'm going to move to Todd on the necessity of travel.
In terms of travel, is a tough one. I mean, there's just no way around it, because you're sending an employee to an environment that you don't control. So there's really no one size fits all answer on travel. What I would suggest is this: have a policy. Number one, a written policy that explains what has to be, what approvals are necessary, what the employee has to do before and after traveling, what reporting obligations they have. All of that really should be spelled out in a written policy. And then in terms of whether to allow travel, again, that is really, really business dependent. Obviously, everything that we talk about today is business dependent. But in terms of whether or not travel is vital to the business, that's really going to be a business decision on a case-by-case basis. But I would suggest this: in regard to each incident in which travel may be necessary, at least analyze the tools that are available. For example, I've been very impressed with the presentation that we're using today. I've also used some other online platforms that are very good, and I would at least consider why those are not adequate for your needs at a minimum. If you're going to have somebody travel, I think you ought to have some explanation for why the online platforms won't satisfy what the need is, and have a written policy. That's really the crucial takeaways on travel.
I did want to add on travel that a lot of employers are imposing quarantines, like imposed quarantines if people do decide to travel. And what's funny about that is, even if the employee travels on business, a lot of employers are still imposing those same quarantines. So even when somebody goes and does something on behalf of the company, when they get back, they still have to potentially work from home or work remotely for that 14-day quarantine period.
I think, Nancy, you addressed, we talked through this slide, right?
Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and move on to the legal compliance section, Todd and Nancy, for the sake of time.
Perfect. So on legal compliance, the first thing obviously is the government agency regulation. And the takeaway here is, yes, CDC and WHO in particular do not have the force of law. OSHA does, but the other two do not. However, we still need to be aware of them for two reasons. One is most of the states are incorporating particularly the CDC guidance into their orders. So to be familiar with the state order, you have to be familiar with the CDC guidelines. But secondly, as we mentioned earlier, we're already seeing the intentional tort suits and the nuisance lawsuits. I'm sure other theories of liability will be articulated. And if you're in a position where you have to defend what you've done in terms of COVID, you don't want to say that we didn't follow CDC guidelines because they didn't have the force of law. That's not a good defense. And so you're going to want to either be able to say, we understood the CD guidelines and we applied them as written, or we understood the CD guidelines, but they didn't work in our industry and here's why, and have something prepared at the time, not post hoc when you're getting challenged on it, but something going into the reopening saying, we understand the CDC guidelines and here's why they aren't practical in our workplace. Saying because it costs too much, I would suggest a little bit more robust analysis, but you definitely want to have something that you can rely on. If you ever get challenged in terms of what protocols you implemented in reopening, you want to have some sort of written analysis that shows, number one, what you considered, number two, what you accepted, number three, what you rejected, and then number four, why you rejected what you rejected. Those four things you definitely want to be able to establish if you get challenged down the road.
Yeah, and with respect to state and local guidelines, I'm just going to do a couple of takeaways on this. And one of them is you really need someone who's focused on the compliance aspects. You want a compliance officer. You want somebody who is monitoring the changes with respect to both in terms of what your state is doing, which can be changing every day. There's very few policies the CDC has had that haven't been either altered or revised or had additions to or policies that, recommendations that they have dropped. And then, and we have spent a lot of time basically just like rewriting protocols based on the changes that are happening every day. So you really do want to have somebody who is in charge of monitoring that. And you can't assume once your protocols are drafted that you're good to go, and those are going to be the protocols that are going to remain in place for the remainder of the remainder of your opening. Make sure that you are navigating the laws across multiple jurisdictions. We have offices all across the country. Every office is subject to different laws, and quite frankly, what we have is a basic set of protocols and then additional protocols depending on what office you're in to comply with what you need to do in that particular jurisdiction. For example, Todd was talking earlier, we talked earlier today in Ohio, the statute, the ordinance there doesn't allow employers to ask for medical certification. So medical notes from a doctor, you can't ask for them. I think the public policy behind that was that we did not want to burden hospitals. We didn't want people to have to go into an already overburdened kind of medical space and ask for doctor's notes. While that was lifted in a lot of the ordinances in other parts of the country, my understanding is that is still in effect there, and that is different than what you might be allowed to do in other of your locations. So you really just want to make sure you're doing that. And then, as I discussed, in addition to all of the OSHA regulations and the CDC and the COVID-related issues that you're having to deal with and recommendations that you're having to deal with, you don't want to forget that you're also subject to the same non-discrimination statutes, the same disability statutes, the same requirements with respect to accommodating workers who have disabilities and so on and so forth, the same leave statutes that you have in your local area. A big one here in California was that there were additional leave requirements with respect to allowing people to stay home for school activities, which, lo and behold, also included a school closure. So people in California and employees in California had some additional benefits that were available to them, and you really want to make sure that you're looking at those statutes that are long-standing and should already be part of your standard set of policies.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, I thought what I would share next is just a quick case study on one of our clients. And as you can see, as we're talking through all this, there's just a lot of unknowns out there. So this case study is on Bellicum. And for context, it's a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company with locations in, I believe it's Texas and California. And they initially chose to use AlertMedia for communications during severe weather events in Houston, specifically, like hurricanes and things like that. But now they've really embraced it for communications and coordination during the pandemic. And they found that it's really foundational to their management of the crisis. Most of their employees, fortunately, are able to work remotely. That means they're now spread all over the place. And some had to be on site. But once lockdown restrictions began to ease, especially here in Texas, where I am, two-way communication became really valuable in facilitating that overall return process to get everyone back to work. And they're using survey notifications for daily employee health screenings, which is a reopening requirement in the state of Texas. Each morning, anyone scheduled to work receives a survey asking if they have symptoms of COVID-19 or if they've been exposed. And it just takes some seconds to reply. And in addition to quickly filtering the healthy from the sick, the resulting insights also allow them to swiftly notify employees in the event of a suspected or even a positive case of COVID-19. So just overall, AlertMedia is helping these guys essentially ensure employee health and safety, maintain business continuity, and then facilitate a safe, smooth, and most importantly, as you've heard so far, a very compliant reopening of the organization.
Thanks, Peter. Lots of questions coming in on the topic of wellness surveys, which was what you shared about, Peter, and we talked about earlier in the presentation. A lot of people are asking around, can I deal with implied consent, or can I consider the fact that they're coming into the office? Does that count, Nancy and Todd, as them filling out a survey and expressly stating that they do not have symptoms, or do we need to actually ask them?
I would recommend that you ask them. In fact, many of the orders require you to do a screening, which means that you either have to do a physical screening as they're coming in, including, reviewing, do they look like they have symptoms? Do they have a temperature check? But in lieu of that, what I think would satisfy that requirement for these orders is some obligation for the employee to basically notify you, yes, I have checked for symptoms this morning. I don't have any COVID symptoms. I haven't been around anyone with COVID, and I don't have anybody with COVID or with symptoms in the household. And that should be something that they're obligated to do. And what we're seeing a lot of are these health certifications that employees are having to fill out. And of course, be very careful, because of course those are medical documents and really are going to be treated in the same way as any other medical documents that employers collect for their employees.
Yeah, thanks. I know that's a benefit that a lot of our customers are seeing, is being able to do that digitally and not require an extra employee or a third party to do those screenings in person when they get to the office. A couple other people are asking, how do they address employees that are afraid to return to work, whether they themselves are immunocompromised or at high risk, or they live with someone who's immunocompromised or high risk?
I mean, I would say the first thing you do is you basically assume that they may be eligible for some type of protection, and you would provide them with all the same documents you would provide to someone who came and said, hey, I have to go take care of a sick family member. And it kind of puts it in the hands of them going to the doctor, getting certified, and potentially being eligible for benefits under either the FFCRA, under FMLA, under ADA for their own disability. If they don't, I mean, what we're really seeing is when it's not so much the reality of any particular vulnerability. What it is really a generalized fear that people have of coming in. And someone might say, well, when my kid was younger, they had some asthma issues, so I don't know how this is going to impact the family. I wasn't really able to get certified, but I don't feel comfortable coming to work. And that, again, goes back to it's going to be a business decision, and the business should really be prepared for those requests and how they're going to manage them. The additional leave may not be required, but as a matter of practice, to retain talent, to retain people you've already trained, you may want to make some adjustment in the workplace to allow those people additional time to come back. And then some employers are saying we really need people to come back, and they are giving people the opportunity to come back. You have 5 days to make whatever arrangements you need, and you do have to be back in the workplace by whatever particular date, or you're going to be considered having abandoned your job. So it's very difficult decisions that are having to be made on that front.
And I think one last question, Nancy, is a lot of people are asking about, can we require our employees to sign something, either to say that they're okay with us asking them about COVID symptoms, or that they release liability and they're not going to sue us if they get COVID at the workplace and we're taking proper precautions? Is that something you're seeing employers do?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of employers ask if they can ask the employee to sign a waiver. So there's 2 things. One of them is, can I ask the employee to sign a waiver? The second thing is, about, everything else in terms of the symptoms and stuff. The first thing is, when it's COVID symptoms, you can ask. Again, you have to narrowly ask and make sure your documentation with respect to whatever questions you're asking really fits I'm asking this person if they've had any COVID-related symptoms, and you can require the employees to fill out a health certification saying all of those things, attesting to the fact that they're coming into the workplace without those symptoms. and you can have them sign off on those things. A lot of employers are using, apps where you download, and every day the employee has to answer, 2 or 3 or 4 questions and submit them before they're able to go into the workplace. That's one thing that you can do. You're going to have a really hard time getting a waiver, because the way that employment works is really you have an obligation under OSHA to provide an environment that's safe from known hazards. And there's a lot of guidance out there on what you have to do in order to meet those obligations. So it's not a question of the employee actually even giving you a waiver, because the employee's not going to be able to give you a waiver of those obligations. You have those obligations by bringing the people into the workforce to basically provide as safe an environment as you can, and the employees are not going to be able to waive their right to that safe environment.
The other thing I would add to that, the other thing I'd add to that as well is just that a lot of this would fall under workers' comp, and in most states, workers' comp is not waivable coverage. And even, on top of that, to get out of the workers' comp structure, employees have to allege an intentional tort. And typically, a waiver of damage from intentional conduct is not going to be enforceable, although that's, that can vary from state to state. But in large part, while I understand the sort of surface appeal of a waiver, in large part, it's really not going to offer much protection.
Makes sense. Well, Nancy, Todd, Peter, thank you so much for your time today.